populists are coming to power.
An increasing divisive and polarised society.
That is the new divide, that is the new debate.
I think the reason we're having this debate is that something quite fundamental is happening. There's a fundamental disruption in Western foreign policy, which is deeply troubling and deeply worrying. And one of the ways that you can see how much the world is changing and how quick the chaos which Donald Trump has unleashed is going through our political systems, our international institutions, is the fact that even Donald Trump jokes are getting out of date very quickly. During the election campaign, Conan O'Brien quipped that 70% of Americans were deeply worried about the idea of a Trump presidency and 30% were becoming Canadian. But if he was making the joke now, he'd realise that the last thing anyone wants to do is to become Canadian, because Donald Trump seems to have a particular animus against America's northern neighbour and sees it as one of the worst foes of the American system. And I think the reason for that is that he has a fundamentally different worldview from President Obama, President Bush, Bush the father, Clinton, Reagan, or any of the other presidents that have been in power, at least in the last 100 years. And I think there are three things which are uniquely worrying about Trump as president. The first is that he is the only US president in my lifetime who has seen the international order as something which undermines rather than enhances American power in the world. And I don't think that he thinks that that order doesn't benefit the West and benefit the US, but he does think that it benefits others more, in particular China. And his starting point is that if he does nothing at all, he will be the president that oversees the relative decline of his great nation, and that China will become the most powerful country in the world, because every year China becomes stronger and richer, and the US, in relative terms, even though it grows, is becoming smaller. But he thinks that the entire establishment and the elite is so wedded to this order and this way of doing things that it's incapable of reforming it. And therefore, what I think he's trying to do is to launch a process of sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction, where the first instance is to blow everything up, with a view then to renegotiating the order on terms which he thinks are more beneficial to the US, because he thinks the paradox of the status quo is that America is paying a lot of money, is losing a lot of lives in order to sustain an order which is helping China more than America. And that's why he's blown up the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which George was talking about, why he's trying to blow up the World Trade Organization, why he's threatening NATO, why he's withdrawing from almost every body that you can think of in the United Nations. It's because these are part of an order which he thinks the US is trapped in, which constrains it. And above all, in his very zero-sum mind, these are all institutions which empower the weak over the strong. And America is the strongest and the most powerful country in the world. So therefore, any institution which brings countries together to negotiate with the US is one which, in relative terms, weakens the US and strengthens other countries against it. And that brings me to the second threat of Donald Trump as president, which is the fact that, going back to my Canadian example, the people that he feels the greatest animus to are American allies, because they're the ones who are propping up the system the most. So he thinks that they are the number one enemies in his process of disrupting the global order. That's why he's much more comfortable dealing with Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un than dealing with Angela Merkel. And the fact that he's undermining US alliances means that every single part of the world where order has been based on alliances with the United States is becoming much more unsafe. That's true of Europe, it's true of Asia, it's true of the Middle East. And what's happening is two things are going on. As American alliances become questioned and people don't know whether they can count on Donald Trump to back them up, the American allies are having to hedge against being abandoned by the United States. So they're having to rethink their options, to rearm, and to up their military spending. But at the same time, the enemies of the United States, its rivals, also wondering whether the US is going to back up their allies. So they're testing out how far America will stand by its allies. And they're also encouraged to rearm and to behave in belligerent ways. So in every theatre of the world, what we're going to see over the next few years are new levels of instability, new levels of violence, and the problems which George Galloway was talking about in the Middle East are not about Western foreign policy and us arming relatively dysfunctional groups in Syria. It's about the fact that there was an order which was guaranteed by Western powers, which has now disappeared. And that's created a space where Iran and Saudi Arabia and others, who were held together in place by a system, are now testing out their power and fighting death, and nobody cares about what they're doing, and no one's trying to stop them. And there are no limits on the instability which can happen as a result of that.
Well, as half an Irishman, I'm entitled to say, as the Irishman apocryphally did when asked the road to London, I wouldn't have started from here. The exceptionalization of Donald Trump, to which you've just been listening, is absurd. Donald Trump's been the president of the United States for less than 2 years. Did the chaos in the world start less than 2 years ago? It's utterly ridiculous. The crooner, your idol, nice soup Barack, destroyed Libya and turned it into a slave market and a jihad market for at least 7 heavily armed different Islamist groups. It wasn't Trump that did that, it was Obama that did that. You have the gall to pray and aid George W. Bush as somehow better than Donald Trump. George W. Bush and your other hero, Tony Blair, killed 1 million people in Iraq and rising, spawned ISIS, cascaded it across the world. You say how happy, how smug you are about the rules-based society that we had before Donald Trump 23 months ago, 22 months ago. Where was the rules-based order in the invasion and occupation of Iraq? And in aid of your argument, you draw attention to the fact that populists are coming to power. The populists are coming to power precisely because of the failure of your international order, precisely because of the failure of your orthodoxy. It's because neoliberal politics totally failed in Italy that you have the government in Italy you have. Ditto in Hungary. Ditto the rise, although it's stopped now. You may have noticed that Mélenchon, with whom I agree in every particular, is now the most popular politician in France. Not Le Pen. She's gone off for psychiatric treatment. The rise of Trump, the rise of Corbyn, the rise of the right and the populists in Italy are all because of the failure of this order, which you so smugly wish to return us to.
So let me give you 3 things that I think really make up the combination of things that makes China right now distinctive, and which then help us decide whether or not those are things that are going to challenge, I don't want to say the West, I mean the liberal world, I think is what we're talking about here, but let's call it the West, in the next few years and decades. And those 3 things are authoritarian politics, economic growth, and directed use of highly sophisticated technology. I think those are the 3 things which I think come together to become much more than the sum of their parts. So number 1 is authoritarian politics. China is one of a very small number of countries that is not only not liberal democratic, but also doesn't make any pretense at being so. Russia is different. Russia holds elections. I am told by various people that those elections are not always entirely free and fair. Sometimes those people then turn up deceased in a gutter somewhere in Moscow. But in a sense, that happening is a sort of hypocritical nod of the hat to the idea that there ought to be elections, there ought to be liberal politics, even if they don't really work at all in somewhere like Russia. This is not what China is saying. This is not what President Xi Jinping is saying. He has made it very clear that the Leninist style of government in which an authoritarian, as they would see it, meritocratic, top-down system through one party operates is appropriate to the need of China and also in many ways superior in terms of the governance it could put forward. And while I wouldn't want to make any judgments, there are certain recent democratic decisions in certain Western countries that, at least in the minds of some Chinese elites, have confirmed them in that view. Second point is about economic growth. I don't want to tread on Linda's
Tread away.
Linda's extremely competent economic toes, when very, very fine toes they are here. But the fact is that many of the things we're talking about,
It's okay. Hashtag you too.
You thought you were here to talk about the future of geopolitics. Instead, we're getting to all sorts of very, very dubious stuff. The direction of travel has been clear for some time, but some of you may have noticed a phrase which has now become very kind of common currency in the China discussion world from the former paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, who was, essentially in charge through the 1980s and much of the 1990s. And he put forward what's become known as the 16-character phrase in Chinese, that's Tao Guang Yang Hui, which is basically about, look, keep your head down, China, make money, get your education system together, start your economic growth going, leave it a good long while, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, then bring your light from under that bushel and shine. Xi Jinping, the leader we have now in China, is the one who's basically taking advantage of that economic growth that Deng Xiaoping was putting forward as the plan for not just a year or two, but for decades, and saying that now we reap the benefits of that. And the third point, and I'm looking here at our chair, who, despite her how can I put it, discreet statements, is in fact one of the great experts the UK has on technology. You may have seen her on TV's Panorama recently. Not the one about abuse in care homes, that was definitely not Stephanie, but the one about technological, wouldn't say what role you were playing in that one, but the one about technology where Stephanie has a great deal to say about the way in which liberal and non-liberal societies are changing because of the technology. But on the case of China, I will say that the ability to produce maybe not first-tier innovation, but extremely high-quality second-tier innovation in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, telecommunications. Why are we having the arguments we're having in the UK about whether we should have a Huawei network? Because Huawei, whatever else you think about the politics, is perhaps the single best quality and best value telecommunications infrastructure that you can get. The fact that China can go from 40 years ago being basically one of the poorest countries in the world per capita to being a country that can seriously consider itself a cybernetic superpower is amazing. And the consequences of that in China, of course, are that the state now uses that power to surveil its own citizens in a non-liberal society without the benefit of independent oversight from the courts, without elections that can change the government. That level of technological power, with that level of economic growth and authoritarian politics, is a never-before-seen combination. That is what the West needs to engage with, understand, and debate.
What is happening in the West, from America throughout sort of Western and Eastern Europe? It's a fragmentation and a breakdown. And the successful parties are no longer to be understood on a left-right spectrum. They're actually a mixture of left and right. There are socialists who believe in leave, there are socialists who believe in remain. But leave and remain are now better predictors of who you're going to vote for than your past tribal identity. So what's really happening is realignment and fragmentation. And largely speaking, I want to suggest to you that the formulation that's taking place, and I think you got it in one, is nationalism on the one hand and extreme liberalism, understood as identity politics, on the other. And I want to suggest to you that neither of them ultimately, in my view, will work. Because we have been governed by extreme liberalism for really since the time of Margaret Thatcher. You have extreme economic liberalism on the right, extreme social liberalism on the left. And they're a common project. And I always think it's incoherent to hear people on the left denouncing neoliberalism economically, but essentially upholding it socially, and vice versa. So what is the liberal project that is now over? The liberal project is essentially a grand global project of extreme individualism. And this grand global project at first appealed to the narcissism of the 1960s and the genuine injustices that the 1960s spoke to. But what it creates is a dispensation economically that only favours those at the very, very top. If you look at the global distribution, the famous elephant graph by Branko Milanovic, he shows that really over the last 30, 40 years there's been no net gain for the vast majority of the working population from globalization. And the gain has been for the working class in the third world, whereas the working class and increasing the middle class in the first world has seen no genuine gain at all. You've seen the rise of rampant insecurity because insecurity stems from rampant individualism, and we've created on the economic level forms of insecurity that were actually unthinkable in the 60s or indeed the 70s. But on the cultural right, and culture we know outcompetes economics in any assessment of human behaviour, liberalism has essentially created a culture that oppresses majorities, that creates marginalised majorities through identity politics that are little more than middle-class power games and attempts by middle-class advocates to both virtue signal and gain power within a medium whereby solidarity has collapsed. So don't be surprised that nationalism is on the way back, because nationalism, by those who advocate for it, is the only thing that will care for them. Nationalism, from the perspective of advocates, is the only thing that will care for those who have lost out, whereas liberalism won't. Liberalism of the extreme left has become an upper middle class project. And so what we've got is a project where solidarity, i.e. looking after us all, has been captured by nationalism, and the project, the right-wing project of extreme individualism, is now followed by both left-wing parties and right-wing parties. That is the new divide. That is the new debate. That is where we are. Thank you.
So I think there are, we can begin with the fact that many of us intuitively, implicitly feel that there is a lacking centre in politics and that there is an increasing divisive and polarised society. So John Curtis, for example, the polling guru from Sterling, argues that British opinion used to be a bell curve with the votes in the centre, and it's now a U-shape with the votes on either side and nothing left in the centre. There are two responses to this. One of them is that this is almost an inevitable feature of the nature of modern discourse, partly fueled by social media. In other words, really, this phone in my pocket and the things that it enables encourages the creation of a public that comes together very quickly against something, that a line runs from the Arab Spring through to Brexit. And part of that line is a general story that there is, to quote my friend David, who's just accused me of living in a bubble, that there is these people living in a bubble.
Being a right-wing populist.
People living in a bubble, okay? And it's the classic language from that thing, right? You guys live in a bubble. And the story is that there are a bunch of people who are out of touch, living up on the top of a little pyramid, who don't really understand what's going on the ground. And this becomes a very powerful weapon, doesn't matter whether you're in Egypt or in Britain, for chucking a hand grenade at those people. It tends to be a negative program. It's very difficult to translate this movement, whether you're talking about the Arab Spring or Brexit, into a positive program of government, because it tends to be an objection towards a particular group of people. Now, the question then is, how inevitable is this? Is there something about the modern world, something about this machine, which means that any attempt to create a centre ground is doomed? And in fact, actually, the professor suggested that it is in the very nature of democratic politics that an attempt to define a centre ground and consensus is anti-democratic. Her implication and her agonistic vision is that actually a truly liberal democracy involves different positions, people dividing lines between them. She likes the divide between left and right. She doesn't like any other divides, but she basically believes democracy involves standoffs between one group and another.
I think it is possible, though, to conceive of something more than simply what she was suggesting. So she was suggesting that the resolution to this is to think of a more dignified, courteous way of imagining that disagreement between the two sides. The two sides continue, but that there are rules by which they play and they give respect to each other's positions. I would argue that there is a way of being a Trumpian anti-Trump, that there is a way of using this machine to advocate not for the positions of the right or the left, not for the positions of no deal Brexit or Remain, not for the positions of equality against liberty, that there is a way of using this to connect to the local. And the more things are embedded in the local, the more plausible it is that through practical work, through action, you can discover the virtue of moderation, right? The virtue of avoiding the extremes, the energy that comes from the intermediate state. And I want to conclude on this. Heraclitus, since we're talking about philosophy, is very interested in the idea of harmony. And what Heraclitus points out is that harmony comes not by losing the opposites, but by suspending the power of the opposites. He talks about harmony in relation to a musical instrument. The sound of the string comes from the string being suspended through the tension of the bow. I'm even more interested in harmony through the bow itself. The sense that the center ground, in fact, is pulling off those two ends, drawing the patriotism from one, the sense of liberty of the other, and then the sense of compassion or social justice the other, in order to create that form. And what gives it its force is that it operates in the realm of reality. Thank you.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.